with Ian on two things, and I'm like, holy crap, I'm going the wrong direction.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Bills. I'm like,
See if that works. So we're going to go ahead and have Mr. Jackson do his presentation.
All right, thank you. Just want to go over the economic assumptions, the economic forecast that goes into the revenue forecast. Review this. Yes, it is. I can pull a little bit closer here. I apologize, my voice isn't in quite 100%. I was kind of going back through my slides from the last year or two, and some things haven't changed very much, which is good in a way, and a few things we probably need to touch on. Really want to talk a bit about the U.S. Outlook, but certainly, everything in light of how it affects the state of Indiana and impacts the state's prospects. In terms of the U.S., growth has been boosted in 2018, by some added consumer confidence, certainly some tax cuts that I guess we knew were coming about a year ago. That started to factor into the forecast at that time. Some additional stimulus spending on the federal side boosted growth, started to boost growth in 2018. We see that continuing into 2019. The forecast reflects that. The tariffs, I always have to kind of check month to month to see what our assumptions are on the tariffs, especially with respect to China. But they create some uncertainty, which poses some challenges for businesses. But overall, we see the impacts being fairly small, kind of in the overall scoring of the economy. Consumer spending still the big story, supported by solid employment growth. Business fixed investment has been solid, maybe not quite what we were expecting, especially in light of the tax cuts. We thought maybe there would be a bit more fixed investment coming from that. But then again, some of that is also influenced by energy spending, which is kind of doing its own thing based on oil prices. The Fed outlook has been our outlook. Our macroeconomists spend a lot of time thinking about what the Fed might do. The outlook has been similar, probably backed off a little bit in terms of what we think increases to the federal funds rate might be over the next couple of years, but overall not a real huge change in that. And we think there's a fair amount of intentionally a fair amount of kind of consistency and predictability that they're trying to provide in that. We do see real GDP growth slowing in beyond 2019. We don't necessarily see that as an indication of a big problem, just more of that's what we see real potential GDP being based largely upon labor force availability and then assumptions about productivity growth. That ultimately, in order to grow your economy, you need to have certain inputs in order to be able to do that, and really labor, and then productivity, putting that labor to work, kind of gives us our long-term ideas about what real potential GDP growth is, and that starts to get pretty low as the fiscal stimulus wears off a bit, but largely as we reach literally full employment, which we don't do very often, but we're seeing it very much there. So just kind of wanted to give that overall view, because then that very much influences how we see the state of Indiana's economy going also. So and I will point out, I don't generally spend too much time talking about the U.S. Economy. I will point out that there are some slides at the end of this presentation that I probably won't get to, we probably won't want to talk about. They are there very much for your reference now and for in the future. So I do want to point point out that those are there, the last few slides, just kind of throwing some numbers at you on that. In terms of the state of Indiana, employment growth has slowed down for the state of Indiana to around 1% per year. That's about what we were expecting, probably just a little bit less than what we've been expecting. Really one of my general overarching comments about the state of Indiana and a lot of neighboring states, relative to the U.S., is that we really, especially in terms of employment growth, we really do expect relatively lower rates of growth, largely because, well, basically entirely because of different population growth. Especially with where we are right now, kind of in the economic cycle with unemployment rates where they are, after a while you get to where, there's only so much your employment growth can grow with, population growth where it is. And, when you're comparing with the U.S. rate of growth, you're comparing with, states with higher population growth, states like Texas, Utah, Colorado. So you need to consider that as you look at, where, or at least I need to look at that when I'm evaluating, individual states and how they relate to the U.S. I just want to explain that right up front. So really, again, employment growth has fallen short a little bit more than maybe we expected relative to the U.S. rate of growth. We don't really see that as anything particularly wrong with the state. I think there's probably a couple of specific industries where they're working through some changes that have hit. I know the information sector, we see that as being a lot of the publishing sector, and some of that can be, software publishing. That gets a little tricky because software published, and if it's distributed, say on, CDs and things like that, that counts as the information sector in terms of literal publishing. When you start to get into more software as a service type of situation, then that shifts it to a different sector. So sometimes some of these apparent job declines can be simply due to, changes in technology, changes in the nature of the industry. We certainly know that the print industry in particular has some challenges to it. And so that's part of what's driving some of the declines in specific sectors. Telecommunications, some of that can be customer support, that kind of thing, are really showing up, having a little bit of an outsized influence in the short run on employment. Manufacturing, certainly still a very large topic in the state of Indiana, especially transportation equipment. That still has been very, very solid. I have some slides later. We'll talk, a bit about our outlook for vehicle sales. It's largely unchanged from what it's been, from what we've talked about over the last couple of years. I don't see much growth from here in vehicle sales, but not, the slowdown that, you could that you could potentially see given how far we've come over the last few years. Looking a little further out, this catches my eye, I guess, as something that I don't see very often is, when we really get job growth, and I'll show that in the next slide in a second, very near, basically getting down to zero. And again, that's not, one thing I'll, go ahead and toss out the recession word that some people toss out. We don't, in any environment, we don't see 0% job growth as a recession anyway. That's more, broader economic growth. But again, it really goes back to that full employment idea that you're very close to, all the job growth you can get with the labor force that's available, and the unemployment rate where it is. Wage growth has been really still a little bit slower, and that's really a national story. Wage growth still a little bit of a puzzle about why we're not seeing wages growing more than they have, given where we are with unemployment and demand for jobs. There can be some various reasons for that. One given is that some of the gains really are showing up more on the benefit side, especially in terms of employer paid, the employer portion of medical insurance, that is compensation, but it doesn't show up in reported wages, but that can be, and then that can take away some from that wage growth portion. We do expect that, wage growth to pick up over the next couple of years, partly out of necessity. And one thing to point out about wage growth also is when we talk about wage growth, that's not so much just earnings per hour. A wage rate is only part of the story there. The other part of the story is the number of hours worked. That when I'm talking about wage growth, I'm talking about your annual wages, which is, your hours you worked, times your pay rate. So there's still room for wage growth in some areas, just in terms of increasing the number of hours that people are working the same job, or people who are already full-time, maybe more overtime, that type of thing. We know that employers have been very, managing things like overtime, very tightly, trying to avoid that added expense. But, it gets to the point where that is the most sensible thing for you to do. So, just raising these points is just things to consider as you see the numbers and see how things move along. Housing is another one that we talk about every time. Still probably, a little bit less than, it's been solid. It's been, certainly better than it was years ago. Probably not, in terms of housing starts, probably not to where we would have expected, given that, where demand is, and especially given, the ground that we feel like we need to make up after the housing decline that we had starting in, 2007, 2008. And, you had a very long overhang from that. And so we really thought that then, given how much that drove down, housing availability, we really thought that we would see overall just more growth in housing than we have seen. And that in itself, can be a very big driver of the economy, and that's been lacking a little bit, not just in Indiana, but in many parts of the country throughout this recovery, just in terms of the jobs it provides, in terms of construction jobs, and all the other kind of supporting jobs to build a home, to furnish a home, and all that. It's just been lacking a little bit. There's various reasons cited for that, rising interest rates or potential rising interest rates. That's been out there for a good while now. Labor shortages in the construction industry. That industry lost a lot of labor really years ago and never really got all of that labor back. Which is certainly an issue. Lack of buildable lots in some areas, that's more of a concern in some than others. Really one that has been difficult to quantify and not one that historically we've thought about a lot, but really is the issue of high student loan debt, hitting really a certain portion, and really a portion of, potential home buyers that we normally would expect to be more active in the market by now, given their age, kind of where they are in their careers, that kind of thing. But just having the levels of student loan debt that they do coming out of the last 10 years or so, really just can't get mortgages. Either won't consider it on their own, or if they do apply for a mortgage, then that ends up being a disqualifying factor. And that's one that we just, I just hear about more and more, coming out of younger folks. So, I just have to respect that. So get into just some graphs, kind of showing, where we've been, where we're going. I really relate the Indiana job growth, the Indiana job market with the U.S. Again, we've kind of, for reasons that I've stated, we generally expect that to be lower than U.S. average. That's not a big surprise. Over the last couple of years, it's slipped, further below the U.S. average than maybe we would have expected. But certainly back in 2015, 2016, a lot of that is related to the transportation manufacturing sector, kind of overriding, population concerns. We see that coming back, closer to the U.S. Average, not really catching back up, and really wouldn't expect it to. But then the other thing that really stands out to me as we get down, especially into 2021, is how close that gets to zero. And again, we don't see that as, a big specific red flag for the Indiana economy, more just that it's partly where we are with the overall U.S. economy. As you can see, U.S. Job growth we have slowing also for similar reasons, but at that point it's very much just lack of labor force. So want to point that out. In terms of growth in economic output, as measured by gross state product. This is one we, to some extent we spend a little less time looking at this, partly because it doesn't directly translate into, especially tax revenues. It's more, tax revenues are a little more derivative of this, but it's still important to know what the potential might be. Growth, your output, can determine where wages might be able to go, that kind of thing. But again, kind of as you look at growth rates in terms of employment, if you're not getting GSP growth out of employment, it needs to be coming out of productivity, and I think that's the key point, and really one of the key points that we've been trying to drive home at the U.S. level as here, that if you don't have the extra people, it needs to come out somewhere else. Just demand in itself won't drive that. So as I look at our assumptions about productivity, it does need to improve from where it's been over the last few years. But we think that with some increased business investment, that kind of thing, that we will see that. But I just want to point out that is an assumption that needs to come true, or an expectation, maybe a better word, that needs to come true in order to achieve the growth that we're talking about. So I'll throw a few more numbers at you here. Certainly won't read through all of them. I don't want to do that, and I don't think you want me to do that. Again, payroll employment we see as getting pretty far down. Unemployment rate, really probably already lower than levels that we thought it could be sustained at, both in Indiana and other, and across many parts of the country. Again, it's worth pointing out on that there are assumptions that go into that number in terms of especially who you're including in the labor force. There are folks out there who are not being counted in the official labor force, who are between the ages of 21 and 64 or whatever, kind of counts as that main age. So we've seen some of those folks, come back into the labor force, for various reasons, and certainly, higher wages can bring people back in. That's been a little bit of a mystery throughout the recovery, is why labor force participation rates did stay as low as they did coming out of the recovery. Wage income, certainly a big one, and one that we focus very much on with the revenue forecasting group. That drives so many things, and we have relatively good data on that also. As you get out into 2019, 2020, very much of that is driven by wage growth, per job rather than increases in jobs. Personal income grows similarly to wage income. There's some differences there in terms of benefits growth. Can be a big one that counts in personal income, doesn't count in wage income, but can have some influence on spending. As we look particularly at sales tax collections, can look a little more at personal income growth rather than strictly wage growth. Farm income is another one I'll throw in there. Notoriously hard, not only hard to forecast, it seems like it's hard to estimate even years after the fact. That's one that we get some just tremendous revisions in that data years after the fact. So I feel badly when that changes and it does move the numbers a little bit a couple of years back, but we kind of have to take what we get on that. But that's one that don't. I think some of you know that's one I could talk a long time about is farm income, but I won't today. At least not any more than you folks deem appropriate. But then certainly personal consumption expenditures is also another one that we've taken a good look at the last few years. Has some relates to sales taxes, and one thing that I'll reserve comment on some of that for a little further out, but it tracks, but certainly not exactly tracks personal income. And I think one thing that we're keeping an eye on there a little bit too is this notion of wealth effects on consumer spending, and that's basically things like it's not really your income, but it's more things like your home value, how the stock market's doing, how your portfolio is doing, can have at least indirect effects on consumer spending. That if you feel good about your assets, even though that doesn't translate into money that you can spend directly, can have an impact on willingness to spend, and so that's one where the stock market hasn't been really keeping up with some of the economic growth indicators this year for its own reasons. But we don't see that as being an issue right now. Housing starts again. We're still expecting some growth in that, but still relatively low levels of housing stock. Kind of given where we are, and really data aren't real great on housing stock. Some of that we have to kind of impute on our own, but we still think there's room for growth in housing starts. This kind of probably getting now into stuff I've already really covered. This just an indicator of wage growth. Now this is one for Indiana and for other states where we don't necessarily expect to see lower population growth states being at a disadvantage in terms of wage growth. One thing I will point out is we had a couple of spikes there, particularly in the first quarter of a couple of these years, and that's really related to bonus. Well, it's partly related to bonuses coming from automakers coming in the first quarter of the last couple of years. That can really move the needle on overall wage growth, and that's something that we have to watch out for, as we look at the forecast, because then then we need to know that occurred, and that informs our view of what we might expect moving forward. That we don't expect those aren't going to occur every quarter. We also saw some pretty unusual bonus activity at the end of last year, a year ago into January and February. Some of that was around the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. We saw some things going on with bonuses relative to both, especially as related to the corporate tax cuts, and some of the things going on there. And those are things that we know some of that always occurs, but it was a little more pronounced the last couple of years. We don't necessarily expect that to carry forward to the extent that it was there. But again, the broader story is that we do expect income growth to be able to come from wage growth over the next 2 or 3 years. A little bit of a look at this kind of a short-term look at some of the.
Excuse me, I had a couple members
Sure,
just ask
sure,
if you could just speak
sure.
up just a little bit.
I'm sorry, speak up?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Been a little bit hoarse the last couple of days. I'm sorry about that. Okay, yeah, sorry about that. Okay. Yeah, in terms of growth over the last year or so, and this is just year-over-year changes in monthly employment numbers. Construction is is one that I look at and basically say, well, it's about time to some extent. From my standpoint, that's one thing that we really had been expecting for a while. Some of this is coming out of the housing industry, but certainly other things occurring to that as well. A lot of commercial real estate activity, industrial activity, infrastructure growth. That all feeds into construction. Historically, housing has been a big portion of that and still is, but some of the other sectors are really driving that. And again, this has been a bit of a laggard relative to what we were expecting. Retail trade is one, and that's really largely just a bounce back from some of the issues that we've seen over the last year or two. I'm staying downtown here, and I know there's a couple of stores that I can't go to now that I would have gone to last year, a couple of years ago, but in other places, then we're seeing some filling in of gaps on that. So a bit of recovery. Transportation and warehousing has been a very hot area in many parts of the country, and historically that's been a big area in Indiana. Again, I think that's an area where you would see even more job growth than you've seen if they would have better luck finding available labor. That's especially true in trucking related industries. Just a lot of trouble finding labor there that we hear is holding back employment and particularly or potentially activity. Leisure and hospitality, that's kind of going down to the bottom end. That one's one that can bounce back and forth. Seeing some good growth, that can depend some on tourism, but it also depends some upon just local demand. Folks going to local restaurants, and that's not entirely tourist. Folks coming in from out of town. And I'll back up here and just make a point about this that I make all the time. Sorry if it's a repeat, but it very much informs my view of the economy in the Midwest, or say in the Northeast, areas like that relative to other parts of the country, is that in terms of economic growth relating to population growth, it works both ways. You need a labor force in order to have employers to be able to hire people and to be an attractive place to be, but then also, especially in the service sector, you need population there spending money in order to generate demand for these for a lot of these economic products, to generate that local demand. Obviously, whether it's healthcare, whether it's retail, just all kind of services, that it works both ways. And that may seem obvious, but it's not always the case. So I really want to point that out. Again, just as part of what I look at. So just wanted to hit some of those high points. Automakers, that's been kind of in the news lately in terms of some of the job cuts in Michigan and in Ohio in particular. Kind of the broader picture there in terms of the bounce back. That top line number is total vehicles. What you'll notice, and I actually compared to what we had a year ago on this slide. And really that split between light trucks and cars is even more pronounced than it was a year ago. And with trucks, we are including SUVs in that, and it's just what people are buying. It's that simple. Probably relatively low gasoline prices is playing a role in that. But that has an impact. Certainly the truck market, truck production is a very big part of the Indiana, transportation, manufacturing sector, so we keep an eye on that. As far as the broader, especially the recent announcements of layoffs and, whether that's any kind of a red flag or anything, I can't speak directly to that. One thing I will point out is that along with those layoffs that were announced, there are other plants that are hiring. I know that even GM. I don't want to single out a particular company any more than I have to, but it was pointed out that well, they're cutting jobs in the Detroit area and in Cleveland, but they're adding a lot of jobs. Now the problem is that a lot of those jobs are being added in Texas or on the other side of the state in Michigan, so that may not be attractive to those folks that the company is saying that, well, these folks can take jobs at other plants that we have, but whether or not those specific workers will do that or not, I don't know. But the broader point that I want to make is that for all the focus on the layoffs, do bear in mind that there are other places that are hiring. And it relates back to this. It's the plants that are making the very small cars that people just aren't buying that are shutting down. But then, the companies then are ramping up production at, pickup truck plants, Ford Expedition, Lincoln Navigator, citing those just as the types and sizes of vehicles that are being produced. So I think that's worth pointing out. None of that may, show up in job numbers one way or the other in Indiana plants. But, I just want to point out, just want to make sure that we're all taking a balanced look at, as we consider the outlook for auto manufacturers. And again, that's just such a big portion, both in terms of, vehicle assembly, but also, whether it's engines, transmissions, things like that go into, that go into vehicles. But overall, we do see, probably just a little bit lower numbers in terms of total vehicle units, partly just because, the shift toward the bigger vehicles, higher margin, you might not expect to move quite as many units, but, certainly worth considering. The next slide on gasoline prices, I partly relate that to the vehicle outlook. Certainly the outlook does rely upon a pretty benign growth rate for fuel prices. And I know that this is, really the, gasoline prices is something that we do talk about with the revenue forecasting group, in terms of their ability to really tighten up the model, breaking out these revenues from the rest of sales tax revenues. So that's part of why I go ahead and point this out here. It's been a very rocky, kind of a roller coaster ride over the last few months in terms of, policy and where we think oil prices go. But, I point this out, for just for that portion of the outlook. Excuse me. Again, I've talked a bit about home building. Again, this kind of shows where we've come from. I've stopped going back to 2000. Maybe I will on this graph. Maybe I need to bring that back out and show that even with this growth, we're still not back to the levels that we had seen back in, say, 2005, 2004. It's questionable whether you want to get clear back to that point, given what came after it. But I guess at least gives some idea of what kind of the potential is for housing starts. But we still see on balance solid growth. A little bit less emphasis on multifamily housing in the state of Indiana than we see in some coastal areas in particular. But just wanted to point that out. Population growth, this is one that I show all the time, again, just because I've already been really talking about it. It is interesting that Indiana, holds up really relatively well, relative to some neighboring states. Not sure exactly what to attribute that to. I do know that Indiana always stacks up well in terms of, business friendliness, that kind of thing, in terms of publications and things. Probably don't have, kind of those older line cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, which have been pulling down the state population growth in some areas. Personal consumption expenditures, I really just kind of throw this one out there to look at the split of potentially taxable items versus non-taxable, and some of the really, I guess, slippage that we call it, in terms of, services that are not subject to state sales tax, and how that translates into spending, and where that's going. So that's pretty much the end. I really don't know what our time expectation was to begin with. I can just kind of wrap up. I apologize. I'm sorry. I want to make clear I'm certainly open to questions all the way through. But this slide is mostly just a rehash of what I've been through. We don't see, particular red flags to speak, but just kind of laying out, where we see the state of Indiana relative to the national outlook.
Questions from the committee? In Italian.
Thank you. Yeah, I have a couple questions about your presentation. First of all, can you, on pages 6 and 7, and I'm sure that it's not, but I'm not getting it. You say on the one hand that you've got on page 6, you've got this graph that shows wage income going down over the next few years. And then on the very next page, you say higher productivity and fewer available workers will translate into higher wages. So how does that work? What do you mean?
Well, in terms of wage income, those are growth rates. So the growth rate is declining. I apologize on that.
Oh, okay.
For wage income, those are growth rates. So it's not growing as rapidly.
But it is still getting higher.
It's still growing, yes.
Okay, all right.
I apologize. I need to do a better job of pointing that out.
And then on page 8, the construction increase, do you have any breakdown on how much of that is new housing versus roads?
I don't. I tried to look at that. I looked at the breakout that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has. The problem is that all of the indicated growth over the past year was in what they call specialty trades, which can can be new housing, it can be remodeling, it can be commercial real estate, specific things. It's just too broad of a category. But anything that's strictly labeled as kind of residential construction has been pretty flat. But I'm pretty confident that some of those gains in that other area is related to new housing.
Okay, but
I'm
we've
sorry,
just
the
spent
short
a
answer
whole
is
lot
no.
of money in this state on roads, and
Mhm.
I'm just trying to figure out if we can make anywhere in your presentation any correlation between the number of construction employment
Right.
tied to our roads program.
Yeah, there is a category for civil engineering, which is a good bit of roads, but it's not certainly not one-to-one. That one has been relatively flat. So in that particular area, it wasn't showing up there, but that doesn't completely answer your question, I know.
All right, and what about the downtick in education jobs? What does that reflect?
I suspect a lot of that is some of the private companies that have, some of the for-profit. It can be a number of things. Some of it can, but I know some of the for-profit, higher education companies have either gone out of business or had some closures and that kind of thing. Now, one thing I do need to point out on that is that is private employers. That doesn't include public schools.
Okay,
So
that's what I wanted
yeah, I'm
to know,
sorry.
so it's not public
I need,
schools.
that's an unfortunate relic of how it's all labeled. I'm sorry. Public education, public schools.
Not in here.
Are in state and local government.
Okay, which is pretty much flat. All right, and then one more thing. Is there anywhere in this presentation, you alluded to it, but is there anywhere in here that you actually can show the impact of student debt on housing market, on consumer, spending?
No, that's something that we've talked about, and I do want to take a look at that. But that's one where we really would probably, kind of really need to drill down into the numbers a little more than we normally do. And really part of that comment came out of a group, discussion that I was in where, if you look at the aggregate numbers, it doesn't look like that big of a problem, when you're comparing it to other things. But, you really you really need to drill down. But no, we have not, but that certainly is something I'd like to look at.
Okay, yeah, I mean, it may not affect all segments of the population, but I think that for one segment of the population, it's a huge factor, so. All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Brown?
Mr. Chairman. Thank you. My question, I know you can't answer on student debt, but a week or two ago, I know, for example, I'd like to know how our students, as they graduate from our public schools, public institutions here, how they compare in terms of the debt load relative to our economy and our wages. Obviously, it's going to be different because I know when we had the higher ed presentation, I believe Purdue had suggested their average debt of a graduate was like $7,500. So I would hope that wouldn't be impactful on their buying a house down the line. And we're assuming these are that age group, they want to buy a house and they're not able to, not because they don't want to, moving
Right.
to the urban core. So it would be interesting to see, that is a big problem, or if we are actually better off in terms of the debt load that they're carrying relative to what they're trying to purchase, so.
Okay.
But I
Yeah,
understand you on that.
well, that's something I can
Thank
look
you.
into. Thank you.
Any other questions from the committee? Representative Brown?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Jackson, for all the information. There's a lot of information to go through. Do you find the population of Indiana is getting older, therefore we're not attracting a young worker to the state?
That's a little bit, not a lot. I've looked at that some, that basically in terms of, the average age of the population in Indiana, probably not as big of a factor as in some surrounding states. I'm not sure what to attribute that to exactly.
How about the nation, though?
It's right about on average with the nation, maybe a little bit above the national average, but I don't recall that it's been a little while since I've looked at that, but certainly, some of the neighboring states that I've looked at, it's more of an issue. So I think Indiana maybe just a little bit above the national average. Not a lot.
Any other questions? Thank you, Mr. Jackson.
Thank you.
morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the State Budget Committee. My name is David Reynolds. I'm the Senior Fiscal Analyst for the Senate Republican Caucus. I'm joined today with Hari Razaf and Dramanana, the Assistant Director of Revenue Division for the State Budget Agency. First off, I want to give you a little background, make sure most of you are aware of this, but I just want it for our general public to understand our revenue process and how the state of Indiana does our revenue. You just heard from Mr. Jackson with IHS Markit. They provide the economic forecast of the variables, if you will, that we use in the equations that the Revenue Technical Committee selects. So the Revenue Technical Committee is that large box in the middle. It's made up of a representative from each of the caucuses and the administration. And then we have Dr. John Mikesell from IU, who serves as a member on that committee. And then we have an advisor, Dr. Dagny Falk from Ball State, on that committee. The purpose of that committee is to select the equations that will be used in order to forecast using the economic variables from IHS Markit. We certainly have support from Hari's team in the Budget Agency and the Legislative Services Agency as well. This process has worked very well for the state of Indiana. It's been in place for about 40 years, and it's considered a consensus forecast. I will also mention to our viewing public and the people here in the audience that all of these documents will be available upon the break of the committee. So first off, just a little review about the major revenue sources year to date through November. Sales tax, 0.9% above the December 17 forecast, 3.7% above the same period in fiscal year 18. Income tax, 1.4% below forecast, generally flat against the same period in fiscal year 18. Corporate, 29.5% above the forecast, 160.3% above the same period in FY 18. Total general fund revenues, year to date, 1.6% above forecast, 4.8% above the same period in fiscal year 18. As we look at this forecast, there are certainly headwinds and tailwinds that we need to consider. Mr. Jackson talked about many of these. The U.S. economy is continuing to have very slow, sustained growth, moving into near record expansion period. Our unemployment rates remained at or below 4%, and as our leading economic indicators point to consistent economic growth throughout 2019. And then there's certainly some headwinds out there that we need to always be mindful of. The trade policies, slowing international growth, and shrinking domestic auto sector. This forecast incorporates the legislative changes. The most recent changes were the fiscal impacts from the 2018 session and special session, the Internal Revenue Code update, and the sales tax exemption on the computer software are both incorporated into this forecast. The ongoing corporate rate reduction is incorporated, as is the FIT rate reduction, and all of the changes to the gasoline use tax distribution that has been made through the recent road funding bills has been incorporated into this forecast. At this point, I'd like to take just a second and recognize Hari and his team. Hari joined us this spring, and along with his team, they spent an awful lot of time this summer digging deep into each of our equations and trying to come up with better models that give us a better economic fit, and I just want to publicly thank them for that, because I think they've come up with some very good equations that we've been able to use. So what you'll see as you work through these numbers is each of the major revenue sources we're using essentially new indicators and new models on how we are forecasting the revenues. So in sales tax, we separated into two equations, looking first at the gasoline use tax and then the remaining sales tax and use tax. In personal income, we're actually looking at three different equations. We look at the estimated pay, then withholdings, and then refunds. And then in corporate income, we have one equation forecasting the adjusted gross income on corporate. And you can see along there is each of the variables that we use. Those are the economic variables that are provided to us by IHS Markit, and those are the variables that go into our equations. Beyond the legislative changes, there were other adjustments to the forecast as well. The committee chose to adjust for the Wayfair online sales the order that came out this fall. In this forecast, the committee is adding $34.2 million in fiscal year 19, $73.5 million in fiscal year 20, and $76.5 million in fiscal year 21. We are continuing to see flat to losses in gaming. This forecast incorporates a $20 million base adjustment for the South Bend Tribal Casino. Now what everybody wants to hear. So I'm going to go through each of the major revenues and the dollars and percentage growth of each of them. So in sales tax for fiscal year 19, the December 18 forecast is $7.9 billion. It's growth over prior year of $259.2 million, 3.4% growth. And that adds $83.9 million over the December 2017 forecast. Individual income tax, I got to jump back to 2020. So for fiscal year 20, growth over prior year is $193.9 million at 2.4% growth. And then for 21, $137 million growth over the prior year at 1.7%. Individual income for 19, growth over prior year, 220.9, 3.8% growth. That's a difference of 114.1 over the December 17 forecast. And then for 2020, 212 at 3.5%. 21, 219.1, 3.5%. Corporate income, for 19, it's $113 million over the prior year. It's a reduction from our last forecast of 97.3 or 11.2% reduction. In 2020, it's 17 million growth over prior year, 2.2%. 21 is 2.3 million or 0.3%. Gaming for 19, taking 20.6 out of the revenue. That's a difference of, it's actually adding 32.8 from the prior forecast of December 17. It's 32.8 increase. In 2020, growth is 3.9 million or 0.9%. In 2021, 2.2 million or 0.5%. All other taxes and revenues, we're reducing the growth as negative 3.5 million or negative 0.3%. And we're adding 45.3 compared to the December 17 forecast. For 2020, 16.1 over the prior year or 1.6% growth. 2021 is 25.2 million growth over the prior year, 2.5%. And then total general fund for 2019, 569.1 million growth over the prior year. That's 178.8 million increase from our last forecast. For 2020, it's 442.8 million, 2.7% growth. And fiscal year 21, 386 million over prior year, or 2.3% growth. And then there's the chart that most people are used to seeing. That's just a compilation and totals up all of the numbers that I just went through. And Hari and I are certainly happy to answer any questions of the chairman or the committee.
Any questions? Jason?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. David or Hari, quick question on page 11 on the sales and use. The percentage growth between 18, 19, and 20 seems to have more of a downward trend, 3.4, 2.4, 1.7, still growth, but not as high each year. And then individual income, relatively stable. Sales and use obviously includes gasoline user tax as well as sales. Is there a differential that one is maybe not growing as fast as the other? Assuming if income stays relatively stable, I assume sales and use would stay relatively stable. Just understanding what might be causing that sales and use tax not to grow as high in those out years.
Well, I'll take a stab at it, and then Hari will chime in and correct everything I said. The equations, if you refer back to slide 6, if you look at the variables within the sales tax and the individual income, personal income and wages are the driving forces, I would say, of both of those equations. And if you then go back and look at the IHS forecast for those variables, you'll see kind of the same trend where it's almost like we're at our peak and we're starting on a slow, still growth, but it's not growing as quickly in the out years, and that's driving the results of the equation. Do you add anything to that?
So overall, gasoline use tax revenues are expected to go down because the distribution to the general fund is lower. So gasoline use tax will go down. Sales tax is one of those things that is expected to go up, but as you mentioned, the growth is supposed to decline, and that is captured with the variables that we picked, because yes, we will see wage growth and personal income growth, but you also have sort of a shift towards spending towards services. You also have prices and interest rates rising. We mentioned the student loans as well as debt service, mortgages, that might have an impact on people's disposable income after all those expenses. So as we expect sort of interest rates to rise and costs to go up, the amount available to spend on taxable goods is certainly supposed to be limited over the long run.
So, sorry, Mr. Chairman, just to follow up. So in the sales and use, that roughly 10% drop on the distribution to general fund is taken into account. So that's some of the drop. If that was taken out, we might see a little bit more of a stable number. But to your point, Hari, still some of those variables in terms of a stabilizing wage, and then the housing side as well. But probably a larger driver is that gasoline use tax not going to the general fund. So, okay, I didn't realize that.
Otherwise, I'll note that in 2019, gasoline use tax revenue are expected to increase despite the lower allocation to the general fund, because gasoline consumption has been pretty strong in Indiana, and that's with higher gas prices. So gasoline use tax is really benefiting in 2019, but thereafter is expected to go down.
Other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Next, we'll have the Medicaid forecast and Dr. Walthall.
Good morning. My name is Allison Taylor. I am Indiana's Medicaid Director, and I'm here to present our Medicaid forecast for you. Just to start, I'm just going to take a few moments to say, you know, it's a great honor and privilege to be in this position. Have been around Medicaid since 2004. Actually sat back here and worked with healthcare providers and was a health law attorney working in and around Medicaid. So to be in this position of leadership is a tremendous honor, and hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit today about some short-term and long-term goals and aspirations for the program. A few themes when we talk about the 18 forecast, really talking about the best use of funds for innovative programs that improve health without adding costs. We've got some programs that I know Dr. Walthall mentioned last week, but community health worker, substance use disorder integration, collaboration with sister agencies, all an effort to really kind of drive that coordination and better care. Themes for the 19 forecast, focusing on maturing programs and really evaluating ways to improve the way we deliver care for high needs individuals. And then from an operations perspective, really focused again on integration and collaboration. My background, it really comes from a place of collaboration. So really trying to drive that within our division and trying to combine health and social services. We're doing a lot of partnerships with sister agencies, so Department of Corrections, State Department of Health, and others to really try to integrate our care. And a focus on external. So our critical partners are not only consumers, but our network of 60,000 plus providers. Really important voice, and trying to really bring that those aspects of our Medicaid program to a common understanding and place where we can really try to improve health of Hoosiers and partner. So I'm going to kick it over in just a second to Rob Damler with Milliman to walk through the forecast modeling. But hopefully you'll hear and see, we've added a few things in this year, again, focusing on transparency. So there will be a few details. We're trying to build a common kind of understanding with the group here, so that way when we talk Medicaid, we're all informed and can really focus on some of the innovation that Indiana is known for. So with that, I will hand it over to Rob.
Thank you, Allison, and good morning to everyone. Again, my name is Rob Damler. I am a principal and consulting actuary with the local actuarial consulting firm Milliman, and I'm a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. This morning, we're going to walk through the December 2018 forecast, not only looking at state fiscal years 18 and 19, but also forecasting into state fiscal years 20 and 21. The last time we presented, which was, I believe, last December, we have updated our data and information for that. We are looking currently at enrollment and expenditure experience information through September 30th of 2018. So what we're doing at this point in time, we're updating through 2019 fiscal year and then projecting into 20 and 21. We do have some prior period adjustments that that are starting to flow through our forecast, and then that takes us through this fiscal year, and then we project enrollment growth and our cost trend into state fiscal years 20 and 21. We do look at a bottom line forecast Medicaid assistance need, general fund assistance need of $2,457,000,000 for 2020 and $2,580,000,000 for 2021, and we'll look at that for each of those numbers. This first page, I think that, or slide 3, you're quite familiar with. It's in a standard format. We do start with state fiscal year 2017 and are showing state fiscal years 2018 and 2019. The top 3 lines of this consistently are for our 3 managed care programs, the Healthy Indiana Plan, Hoosier Care Connect, and Hoosier Healthwise. Each of these 3 programs in total in state fiscal year 20 and 21 will encompass more than 50% of our total expenditures. They totaled right at $7 billion in each of those fiscal years on a state and federal basis. Those are our 3 largest programs. In addition to that, we still do continue to have some members in fee-for-service program that receive services on a fee-for-service basis. Many of those may occur either individuals who are receiving long-term services and supports, either in a nursing home, those who are dual eligible, those on home and community-based services. We also do provide quite a bit of retroactive eligibility. Members who are eligible for either Hoosier Healthwise or Hoosier Care Connect populations will have retroactive eligibility, which is also provided on a fee-for-service basis. The next 2 line items that are illustrated there are our long-term services and supports populations, our long-term care institutional care, which includes both nursing home populations and institutions for those with developmental disabilities, and our long-term care community care populations, which are our 1915C home and community-based waiver population, serving those that could qualify for institutional care, however, they are remaining in the community setting. We continue to pay our Medicare buy-in that had started back in 2006, and that is a state-only line item that we pay for the Medicare Part D program. We have rebates and collections primarily driven by our prescription drug rebates. We do illustrate here a carve-out for our CHIP and Money Follows the Persons programs, which have separate funding streams. And then we continue to have other expenditures under disproportionate share, upper payment limit, and others. But those 2 items are 2 largest items. So the top half does show our total federal expenditures at over $13 billion in each of the next 2 fiscal years, at $13.4 billion in state fiscal year 2020 and $13.8 billion in fiscal year 2021. Much of that is through federal funds, and intergovernmental transfers occur, as well as hospital assessment fee funding and HIP 2.0 funding, to net down to just over $10.9 billion of all other funding sources in 2020 and $11.2 billion in 2021, and netting down to the 2 numbers that were previously indicated for our general fund assistance need. So a lot of values that are illustrated there. Again, our largest programs really are either our long-term services and supports, which has close to $3 billion, over $3 billion worth of expenditures, and our managed care programs, which is over $7 billion of our expenditures per year. Questions? Just move on. All right. We do have some adjustments as previously indicated, and I'll just walk through these. We do show values both on a state and federal basis, as well as on a general fund assistance basis. So for capitation payments, these are the payments made to the Medicaid managed care plans. We do have to wait to receive approval of the review of the certified rates by CMS, and so that approval process has taken quite a bit of time, so we still have not fully paid calendar year 17 rates or calendar year 18 rates. We are looking to have those completed, however, in state fiscal year 2019. The health insurer fee, there is a payment that was due in calendar year 2018, and for 2019, the health insurer fee under the Affordable Care Act is waived, and then it does restart in calendar year 2020. So we do have to pay for that as well in state fiscal year 2021. We do have some recoupments to reflect our medical loss ratio. So we will receive some of those funds back that we paid out in calendar year 15. Most of those are federal funds because that was under the Healthy Indiana plan. We have some retroactive eligibility that occurred in the managed care program that we need to make some modifications and payments, settlements on those. We continue to have our 3% cost savings reductions. General impact on the general fund impact is approximately $30 million a year. And then we are anticipating continued implementation of community engagement for the Healthy Indiana plan, and we will incur some administrative costs associated with that. Two major initiatives, one major initiative and one, I guess, is more of an accounting implementation of transferring some intergovernmental transfers. This is shown on slide 5. We do have a hepatitis C initiative. Allison can address some of this a little bit more directly if you have some questions on that. We are projecting approximately 9,000 new members to receive treatment for hepatitis C in both state fiscal year 2020 and 2021. Per treatment costs are approximately $48,000. We do receive quite a bit of pharmacy rebates on that, approximately 60% rebate, but there are some timing differences. So we will have a higher federal or higher fiscal impact in 2020 until those pharmacy rebates, which take about 9 months to come in, and then we do see a reduced cost in 2021. So in each of those 2 years, we do anticipate treating approximately 9,000 individuals with hepatitis C at an additional cost of $48,000 per member. And then we are eliminating some of our IGTs, and we're moving those into Medicaid assistance, which is impacting our budget as well. General fund impact on Medicaid assistance is approximately $135 million. So that covers most of the Medicaid assistance. One additional item that I don't believe we've covered previously directly in these presentations has been for the CHIP program. As you may recall, under the Affordable Care Act, CHIP had an enhanced funding of 23% through federal fiscal year 2019. An additional 11.5% in federal funding has been approved for 2020. But then we'll revert to the normal CHIP enhanced federal matching rate for federal fiscal years 2021 and beyond. We are assuming no change in CHIP eligibility, and the values that are shown here do not include CHIP administrative costs. So you can see in 2019, our projected appropriation need in 2018 and 2019 is about $1.8 million in 2018, $1.6 million in 2019. However, in 2020, due to the reduction in federal funding going away, our projected appropriation need does take a significant increase to $18.4 million, and then the federal assistance funding match rate goes further down in state fiscal year 2021, and we will need $42 million in state fiscal year 2021. So that's really being driven, as you can see, the CHIP expenditures are relatively flat at just over $230 million each year, but it's the federal matching rate on these programs that is really impacting our funding need for the CHIP program, which has historically been funded through, my understanding, through the tobacco settlement funds. Continue. Finally, after the CHIP program, continuing on, just want to highlight our Medicaid assistance forecast. These are average monthly enrollment in each of our 3 programs that are managed care. You can see in our Healthy Indiana plan, where over 400,000 members are enrolled in Healthy Indiana plan. Our Hoosier Care Connect program is over 90,000 members on a monthly basis. Those are the disabled, adults and children, as well as our foster children program. And then Hoosier HealthWise, we have over 600,000 lives in our Hoosier HealthWise managed care program. And then finally, our fee-for-service programs, including the institutionalized and other LTSS populations, and our fee-for-service programs, over 380,000 lives each year. And we're approaching right at 1.5 million lives enrolled in Medicaid on a monthly basis through 2021. As you can see here on a bottom line basis, we are projecting in state fiscal year 2019, a slight decrease of 0.3% enrollment from 2018. So through economic changes throughout the state, we are seeing a slight decrease in enrollment of the program. And that brings us to the end of our presentation.
Senator Talley.
Thank you, and thank you for your presentation. I just want to ask you a little bit about this last page. The growth rates on all of these seem to be, moving towards 0 to very low. Are you suggesting that all of this is due to the fact that we've got better income, better economic conditions in the state?
The low enrollment projection, where we are taking it from a slight negative to just over 1%, it does assume that the economic conditions that the state of Indiana and the remainder of the country, we do observe flat to negative increases in many of our state Medicaid programs that we work in. And so we are projecting that it will turn slightly positive, but this also does assume that economics do not change significantly over the next biennium. So that,
All right, but, so let me just ask you that, so the total Healthy Indiana plan, okay, shows 0 growth by fiscal year 21, no new people added?
we are projecting that for the expansion adult populations, as well as the low-income family adults that qualify under Healthy Indiana Plan, that it will be a relatively flat population in 2021 in our projection.
Okay.
Representative Brown.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. How do we fare to other states around us as far as the percent of population that we serve?
I would, some of the other states have had slightly higher take-up in some of the Medicaid expansion populations than the state of Indiana. I would say that we're at approximately the same or slightly lower than the percentage of population that we currently serve. I think we're maybe in the 21 or 22%, and I have observed some other states in the 23 to 24% range at the higher end. So it does vary, and there are still some variables that do allow for different federal poverty limits of qualifying, that each state will pick up more lives or have slightly fewer lives as well.
Mr. Didich?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Rob or Allison, quick question on the health insurer fee for state fiscal year '21. That's assumed that that continues. There could be a change in the federal government that is waived for that time period as well, but you're assuming that that will occur based on what's in law, but uncertain at this point.
Correct. Under current law and current regulation, it is expected to be, it is required to be paid. So to the extent that changes, then it would be removed. Thank you.
What we're going to go ahead and do now, since most of you are here for the forecast and don't want to stay probably for the business meeting, we're going to take a 15-minute recess to let the room clear out, and then we'll resume. Thank you.